Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to all of you for coming. This is an important issue, and I'm glad we're holding the hearing. Millions of Americans all across the country, including so many in my own home state of Utah, are paying significantly higher prices to own, rent, or otherwise live in a home in 2023. Home ownership is even further out of reach for Americans than it has been at any other time in modern history. And this has created problems that we hope to address and discuss today. Just since July of 2021, just over 2 years ago, the affordability of a home has declined significantly, even in that narrow time frame. According to the Home Ownership Affordability Monitor, housing accounted for about 28% of Americans' median income in January of 2021. It's a lot of money. That's up then from what it had been just a few years earlier, when it used to be much lower than that. But, you know, it's a sizable chunk. People were spending over a quarter, between a quarter and a third of their income on housing. But let's look at what happened since then. It's jumped to a whopping 44% by September of 2023. These rates are worse than those seen during the financial crisis of 2008. Homes are less affordable today than at any other time since we started keeping track of this particular set of records back in 2006. We've never seen anything this bad since we began keeping those records. The monthly mortgage payment on a median-priced home has more than doubled in just 2 years. In 2021, it was $979, while today that payment is $2,059. It costs a family almost $13,000 more per year to live in the same house than it did just over 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, the moment our current president took office. And with rents at record highs, many Americans have limited housing options available to them. If Americans are spending 44% of their income, close to half of what they make, on housing, and $13,000 more per year than they did just 2 years ago, it leaves families with less income, fewer resources, and less savings left over to pay for basic essentials, such as groceries, gasoline, cars, all of which have become dramatically more expensive at the exact same time that housing has become unaffordable. So with less ability to pay for these basic needs, there isn't money left over from anything else, whether that's an emergency, unforeseen expense related to a car repair or a health condition, a family member who needs help, or a desire to go on a family vacation or buy something that the family needs. There isn't room for it because everything else has been taken up. And ultimately, the increased share of a family's income spent on housing may cause them to take on even more debt to make ends meet, and this in turn, over time, is going to lead to more bankruptcies. Many failures may contribute to the sudden, abrupt, and severe rise in housing costs. We've got a number of things that we could look at. The first one I want to mention involves state and local regulations, which account for a significant constraint on housing supply. Anytime we look at the price of a particular thing, whether it's a good or a service or something as basic as a home, you have to look at supply and demand and how those two are interacting. And these things, these regulations, impose significant constraints on housing supply at the same time when demand is hardly going away, and in many states like Utah, it's increasing rather abruptly and dramatically. In cities across America, residents are burdened with zoning and overburdensome land use regulations at the federal, state, and local levels. And these regulations decrease the housing supply and, in many cases, directly prohibit housing development, increase costs, create uncertainty, and they produce significant delays. For example, The affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, originally adopted by the Obama administration, increased compliance costs and the cost of housing by adding additional federal zoning restrictions. Those restrictions aren't always things that show up as obviously the product of federal action, because they translate into these local units of government adopting new regulations, new restrictions in response to the AFFH rule, because they have to comply with those rules in order to continue receiving federal funds. For example, under the Community Development Block Grant Program. And it appears that the same will be true of the Biden administration's version of the same rule, which has not yet taken effect, but will soon. Second, Americans are suffering through an extended period of high inflation generally, which has been particularly acute in the housing market. Throughout 2021, the inflation rate jumped to as high as 9%, more than 4 times the Federal Reserve's target inflation rate of 2%, in large part due to profligate federal spending and irresponsible monetary policy. Home prices rapidly increased over the last 5 decades, eclipsing the inflation rate by 150% since 1970. In fact, if home prices grew at the same rate as inflation since 1970, the median home price today would be just $177,788, rather than $408,100. Finally, the federal government's land ownership is also a critical factor, especially in parts of the United States that, like Utah, are home to vast swaths of federal land in holdings. In 2021, the states with the highest increases in home prices year over year were, not coincidentally, Arizona at 28.8%, Idaho at 28.7%, and Utah 24.5%. This comes as no surprise to us in the West. The federal government owns a really obscenely large percentage of our land. In Utah, the federal government owns about 67% of all the land in Utah. That's 2/3. While a small portion of this land consists of scenic national parks, most federal land in the West is managed by the Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service, and most of it doesn't look like the postcard-worthy picturesque viewscapes that you see associated with national parks. It's just land that the federal government owns, holds, refuses to sell, refuses to allow development on, and very often is used to lock people out of access to all kinds of things in the state, including, on occasion, their own property. Now, the United States now has a record shortage of over 5 million homes. In 2021, the states with the highest increases in home prices were located in the West. Unfortunately, finding available land to increase housing supply is a real struggle. I mean, it's very, very difficult, simply because it's not there, because we don't have very much of this rare commodity known as private land. And you have to have private land in order to build housing. So I've introduced a bill called the Houses Act, which would create a process by which local communities could nominate small tracts of run-of-the-mill BLM-managed land to be used to quickly address housing shortages and availability. And these are in holdings that are in or immediately outside of a city or town boundary, a place where people live. The Houses Act would help solve Utah's land and housing scarcity by allowing parcels of federal land to be purchased by a state or a unit of local government at a reduced price, giving them much-needed flexibility to address housing constraints. The act would require that land be subject to a density requirement and would protect against the development of expensive second homes purchased from the federal government on the parcels at issue. Now, in Utah, there are almost 23 million acres of federal land that happen to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management in the state, accounting for 43.24% of the total land in the state. Typical home prices in Utah have increased by 89% just over the last 5 years. 89% in 5 years. If just 1% of the acreage in Utah managed by the Bureau of Land Management in my state were made available for housing under the Houses Act, at least 774,000 additional homes could be built. We have large families in Utah, and we reproduce rapidly, so we're going to need those homes. This hearing is intended to examine some of the factors contributing to the increased costs of homes, specifically some of the factors that members of the subcommittee might be able to help mitigate or potentially eliminate. And I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.